Her daughter-in-law closed the door in her face on Christmas morning. Helen Foster, retired antiques dealer and widow, didn't plead. Rachel's perfect wreath swayed behind the glass, as laughter carried from inside. Within a week, Rachel's name would vanish from Helen's will, her deed and the Victorian she'd restored by hand. She'd spent decades building a legacy. Now she was its fiercest protector. And when Rachel came for what she thought was hers, the trust would speak louder than Helen ever needed. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The cold Savannah morning bit at Helen Foster's cheeks as she climbed the wide front steps of her son's Victorian home. Holiday light displays glowed along the block, porches wrapped in golden strands, inflatable snowmen bowing in the breeze, the faint smell of cinnamon and wood smoke riding the air. She balanced a red tin of pecan sandies on one hip, a handled gift bag heavy with wrapped boxes in the other. Rachel's wreath was flawless. Glossy magnolia leaves, a satin bow tied with a precision that made Helen's own porch garland seem homemade. She pressed the doorbell, hearing muffled Christmas music inside, the chatter of voices, and the scamper of the family dog's paws across hardwood. The door opened, and Rachel stood framed in the glow. Her hair shone as if every strand had been told where to be. The scent of expensive perfume pushed past the cinnamon. She looked at the tin, then the bag, then at Helen's shoes, where tiny salt crystals from the street clung to the soles. "Merry Christmas," Helen said, her voice calm but bright enough for the occasion. Rachel didn't return the greeting. Her gaze hardened into a thin, brittle glare. "We talked about sugar," she said flatly, nodding toward the tin. Helen blinked. "Pecan sandies aren't exactly. This isn't a good time." Rachel cut in, glancing over her shoulder toward the sound of laughter. "We have plans." Helen hesitated. "I brought Emily the scarf she wanted. Green like the live oaks." Rachel's lips tightened. "We'll see her later." A man Helen didn't know passed through the foyer carrying a platter, barely glancing her way. Candlelight flickered over the perfect symmetry of the entry table. Unscented white tapers, a framed photo of David, Rachel and Emily smiling at Tybee. Helen took a breath. "Rachel, goodbye, Helen." The door moved toward its frame. It didn't slam with violence. It closed with the quiet finality of a decision already made. Helen stayed frozen for a moment, her hand still hovering where the brass handle had been, the cold creeping up through her ankles. She caught movement above, a curtain shifting. Emily's face appeared at an upstairs window, pale in the backlight. The girl pressed her palm to the glass, mouthed something, "Grandma," and frowned. Helen lifted the tin slightly, a makeshift wave, but Emily glanced over her shoulder and vanished. The curtain fell back into place, setting the tin carefully on the doormat. Helen wedged the gift bag in the corner by a planter to keep the wind from taking it. She listened for footsteps. None came. The music inside swelled again, covering any chance of her name being spoken. The walk to her Buick felt longer than the short stretch of sidewalk allowed. Spanish moss drooped from the live oaks like strands of gray silk, whispering against the wind. She drove away slowly, past other homes where families clustered in picture book tableaus behind frosted windows. A giant plastic Santa waved from one yard, his arm bobbing with mechanical cheer. Helen didn't turn on the radio. The heater filled the car with a low hum, the only company she needed for the drive back downtown. Broughton Street's overhead lights glittered like a festival canopy above the sleeping storefronts. She passed the cafe where she and Evelyn sometimes split a cranberry scone. A barista in a Santa hat carried a milk crate to the curb and caught her eye. Helen smiled faintly, then kept going. Her own Victorian greeted her with the quiet dignity of old wood and years of survival. The wraparound porch smelled faintly of pine from the garland she'd hung herself. Inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards and the steady tick of the grandfather clock filled the silence. She hung her coat on the hook by the door, set her keys in the blue ceramic bowl with the gold lacquered crack, and carried the kettle to the sink. The water boiled quickly. She poured it into her best china cup, no paper mug today, and carried it to the armchair by the front window. She didn't reach for her phone until the steam had fogged her glasses. When she did, the screen lit up with nothing from David, just a group text from the church ladies, a picture of Viola's dachshund in a Santa sweater, and a polite Mary from the UPS driver. The absence of her son's name was louder than any message could have been. She set the phone down on the side table. The clock ticked in the quiet, the kettle cooled, and outside the winter light stretched across her porch. The ring of the phone startled her. Evelyn Moore's voice came through, sharp as a tack. "You still have Rachel in your will, don't you?" Helen sat at her kitchen table, the steam from her untouched tea curling upward like a question mark. Evelyn's voice still echoed in her head, sharp, direct, impossible to dismiss. The pale winter light slanted through the lace curtains, falling across the antique oak desk she'd inherited from her father. That desk had weathered decades of invoices, handwritten letters, and receipts for furniture now scattered across Savannah. Today it would hold something far heavier. She crossed the room, her slippers whispering against the rug, and pulled open the bottom drawer. The scent of cedar and old paper breathed out as she lifted the envelope marked "Last Will and Testament." Her name was typed neatly across the front, her handwriting noting the year it had been signed, 2017. She broke the seal with her letter opener, the blade gliding too easily, as if it wanted the contents exposed. The words on the pages were as cold as the air drifting through the old sash window. She skimmed until she reached the distribution list. David's name appeared first, his share clearly stated. Emily's name came next, along with a few special bequests Helen had carefully considered. Then came the line she hadn't thought twice about at the time: Rachel Foster, 1/3 of the remaining estate. Her jaw tightened. Rachel, who had closed a door in her face less than an hour ago, was slated to inherit part of the home Helen had restored with her own hands. The irony made her fingers itch. She remembered the hours scraping paint from banisters, polishing the brass until it caught the sunlight just so. Rachel hadn't lifted a finger for any of it. The kettle clicked off behind her, but she didn't move to pour. Instead, she reached for the phone and dialed Evelyn. "You were right," Helen said the moment her friend picked up. Evelyn didn't waste time with pleasantries. "How much?" "1/3 of what's left after David and Emily." On the other end, Evelyn let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a growl. "She doesn't deserve a cent, Helen. Not after this morning." Helen stared at the will, her thumb pressing into the crease of the paper. "It's time to change it. You call Charles Denton," Evelyn urged. "Don't wait. You know how you are. You'll stew on it, talk yourself into giving her the benefit of the doubt. And for what? More slammed doors." Helen allowed herself the smallest smile. Evelyn knew her too well. "I'll call him now." She hung up and immediately dialed Charles's office. The receptionist recognized her voice. Charles had been her attorney for nearly 20 years, handling everything from shop leases to the closing on her Victorian. When he came on the line, his tone was steady, but Helen caught the undercurrent of curiosity. "This sounds urgent," he said. "It is. I need Rachel removed from my will." There was a pause, then the faint scratch of a pen against paper. "We can handle that immediately. Do you want to add to anyone else's share, or simply redistribute?" "Emily's portion," Helen said without hesitation. "And I want it airtight. No room for challenge." "I understand completely," Charles replied. "If you can come in tomorrow morning, we'll make the changes on the spot. Evelyn can serve as your witness if she's available." "She will be," Helen said, her voice firm. A faint chuckle came through the line. "Good. And Helen, if we do this right, she'll never see a dime." The words settled in the air between them, like the satisfying click of a lock turning. Helen felt something she hadn't felt all day: control. She placed the will back into the envelope, not with care but with finality. Tomorrow it would be rewritten, and the ink on the new pages would be hers alone. The next morning, Savannah's streets were slick from an overnight mist, the cobblestones in the historic district gleaming like wet coins. Helen's heels clicked steadily along the sidewalk as she approached Charles Denton's law office, a brick building tucked between a boutique hotel and an art gallery. The faint smell of coffee drifted from the cafe across the street, but she didn't slow down. Today wasn't about comfort. Inside, the reception area was warm, the faint scent of lemon polish on the wood mingling with the aroma of fresh paper. Framed photographs of Charles shaking hands with clients lined the walls: weddings, new homeowners, small business openings. The receptionist, a young woman in a cranberry blazer, greeted her by name and offered coffee. Helen declined. She was here for precision, not pleasantry. Charles emerged from his office moments later, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of easy posture that suggested he never lost a case worth remembering. "Helen," he said warmly, ushering her in, "let's get you settled." His office smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, though Helen knew he hadn't smoked in years. Law books lined the shelves, their spines neat and unbroken. On his desk, a neat stack of documents waited beside a fountain pen. Evelyn sat in one of the two guest chairs, her lipstick a shade redder than the cranberry of the receptionist's jacket, her eyes sharp with approval. "I thought you could use moral support," Evelyn said, leaning back like she owned the place. Helen sat, her purse tucked neatly at her feet. "Let's get started before I change my mind." Charles adjusted his glasses and slid the will across to her. "Here's your current version. We'll remove Rachel's name entirely and reallocate her portion to Emily. I'll make sure the language is unassailable. No room for contest." Helen scanned the lines, her gaze catching on Rachel's name like a burr. "Gone," she said simply. Charles's pen moved in clean, deliberate strokes. The scratch of nib on paper filled the room, oddly satisfying. He rewrote clauses, adjusted percentages, and added protective wording. Helen didn't fully understand but trusted. Evelyn leaned forward to watch, a faint smile curling her lips each time Rachel's entitlement disappeared into a fresh sentence. When Charles pushed the revised document toward her, the paper felt heavier in her hands. She read through slowly, her pulse steady, noting every change. Emily's share gleamed like a promise in black ink. "This looks right," Helen said finally. Charles turned the document toward her and set the pen on top. "Sign here, and again here." Helen took the pen, its weight balanced perfectly in her fingers. The ink flowed smoothly, sealing her intent in the graceful loops of her name. Evelyn stepped forward to sign as witness, her handwriting brisk and sure. Charles gathered the pages, tapped them into order, and slid them into a crisp manila folder. "Congratulations, your estate is now exactly as you want it." Helen exhaled, not realizing until that moment how tightly she'd been holding her shoulders. "It feels lighter," she admitted. "It should," Evelyn said, rising. "That's the sound of a door closing, Helen. One that doesn't need opening again." Helen smiled faintly. "Rachel doesn't even know it yet." Charles leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "If you want to take this one step further," he said, "we could move key assets into a living trust. It would make everything even more secure, and keep it entirely out of reach." Helen tilted her head. "A trust," he nodded. "A trust is harder to contest than a will. And with the right structure, well, let's just say she'll never even get close." Evelyn's eyebrows arched with interest. "I like the sound of that." Helen looked from Charles to Evelyn, the faintest glint in her eye. "Tell me exactly how that works." 2 days after signing the new will, Helen sat once more in Charles Denton's office, the winter sun streaking through the tall arched windows and striping the Persian rug in gold. Outside, the street hummed with post-holiday shoppers, the sound of distant bells from a passing tour carriage, mixing with the faint hiss of tires on damp cobblestone. Inside, the air was still and deliberate, smelling faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Charles slid a thick folder across the desk, his fingers resting on it as if it were a vault. "This," he said, "is your living trust. We'll place your home, your savings, and your antiques into it. From this moment forward, they'll no longer be in your name directly." Helen's eyes moved over the neatly typed pages. "And Rachel?" Charles's mouth twitched in what could have been a smile. "She won't even be a shadow in this document. Emily will be the primary and in some cases sole beneficiary. With the trust, everything transfers without probate. No delays, no contest. Evelyn, sitting beside Helen in a crisp navy coat, leaned in. Sounds like a locked vault with a velvet rope. It's exactly that, Charles replied. And you hold the key until the day you decide to pass it on. Helen's pen felt warm in her hand as she signed the first page. She could feel each stroke carve out a line of protection. The legal language was dense, but the intent was crystal clear. Every antique, every dollar, every square foot of the Victorian she'd preserved was now bound in a structure Rachel could never touch. When they reached the section detailing her antiques inventory, Helen paused. The list was longer than she remembered. Rosewood cabinets, Waterford crystal, Civil War-era sideboards. Her shop days had been full of treasures, but these were the pieces she'd kept, the ones with stories. Every item here will be part of the trust, she asked. Yes, Charles said. If you ever choose to give something away while you're alive, you can. Otherwise, they're preserved exactly as you specify. Helen signed again. She felt an odd lightness, as though she had just moved a mountain without lifting more than a pen. When the last page was complete, Charles gathered the documents, slid them into a heavy binder, and placed it gently. I'll file everything with the necessary agencies this afternoon. The trust will be active before the day is out. Evelyn gave a quiet whistle. That, my friend, is how you start a new year. Afterward, they walked 2 blocks to a small cafe tucked in the corner of a brick courtyard. The scent of fresh bread and garlic drifted from the kitchen, and the sound of clinking cutlery and low conversation wrapped around them like a blanket. They chose a table near the window, where the view of the moss-draped oaks framed their champagne flutes. Evelyn raised her glass. To iron gates and good decisions. Helen touched her glass to Evelyn's, the bubbles snapping softly between them. And to keeping what's mine in the right hands. They lingered over shrimp salad sandwiches and lemon tarts, watching the winter light fade into the pale blush of evening. Helen felt lighter than she had in years, freer, as though the house itself might sigh with relief knowing it was safe. When she returned home, the answering machine's red light blinked in the dim hallway. She pressed the button. David's voice filled the room, threaded with forced calm. Mom, I think we've had some misunderstandings. Maybe we can talk? Rachel's willing to put things behind us. Call me when you can. Helen stood still until the message ended. The machine beeped, waiting for her to act. She pressed delete. That night she poured herself a single glass of sherry and sat in her reading chair by the bay window. Outside, the lamplight pooled on the sidewalk, catching the slow drift of Spanish moss. Her home felt like a fortress now, quiet, strong, untouchable. The next morning, Charles's voice came through on the phone, brisk and certain. Helen, everything's filed. The trust is active as of today. The invitation came in the form of a clipped voicemail from David. Just dinner. No drama. The words carried that familiar pleading tone, as if he were holding a leash attached to a restless dog and begging it to behave. Helen considered ignoring it. She'd been living in a calm rhythm since the trust papers were signed, mornings with the paper and coffee, afternoons sorting her antiques, evenings with a book or Evelyn's sharp commentary over tea. But curiosity, and perhaps a touch of maternal duty, made her say yes. The restaurant was one of those southern fusion places that charged too much for collard greens and dimmed the lights to hide the small portions. Helen arrived precisely at 7, greeted by a host in black, who guided her to a booth in the corner. David was already seated, wearing the same pale blue sweater she'd given him 3 Christmases ago. Rachel sat beside him, her coat still draped over the seat, as if she hadn't decided to stay. Emily was across from them, a small wrapped box in front of her like a peace offering. Mom, David said, standing briefly to kiss her cheek. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Rachel didn't rise. Helen. The single word was crisp, polite enough to avoid open conflict, but not warm enough to thaw anything. Emily smiled brightly. Grandma, you look wonderful. That scarf is perfect on you. Helen smoothed the emerald wool at her neck. Thank you, Emily. It was a Christmas gift from me. The menus provided a brief shield from conversation. Helen ordered trout almondine. David chose chicken. Emily picked shrimp and grits, and Rachel selected only a salad, her voice flat. The air was thick with the smells of butter and roasting meat, but Helen noticed Rachel's fork tapped against her plate in a steady, faintly irritated rhythm. Emily tried valiantly to keep the conversation afloat. "Classes start back next week," she said. "I'm taking a new photography elective. My professor says the winter light in Savannah is perfect for portraits." "That sounds nice," David said, nodding toward Helen. "Maybe you could take some photos of the house." "I'd love that," Emily said warmly. Rachel's eyes flicked toward Helen, then back to her salad. "If she's willing." Helen cut her trout delicately. "My door's always open for Emily." A pause fell over the table, broken only by the clink of cutlery. From the corner of her eye, Helen saw David studying her, his mouth tightening, as if he wanted to steer the evening into safer waters and couldn't find the oars. Her phone buzzed against her purse. She glanced down discreetly, Evelyn's name on the screen with a short message. "Still alive? Need rescue?" Helen allowed herself the smallest smile and typed back a quick "all good." For now, the waiter brought dessert menus, but Helen shook her head. "No thank you. I should be going." David looked disappointed but didn't press. "We'll walk you to your car." "That's not necessary," Helen replied. "Enjoy your evening." Emily stood to hug her. "I'll call you tomorrow, Grandma." Rachel didn't move. She simply reached for her water glass, eyes fixed on some point beyond the table. Outside, the night air was cool and carried the faint tang of the nearby river. Helen walked to her Buick, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She slid into the driver's seat and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The headlights painted the street in pale yellow as she pulled away. Back home, she went straight to her desk. The calm she'd maintained all evening settled into something firmer, a resolve that felt like steel under her skin. She drew out her stationery, the heavy cream paper embossed with her initials, and began to write in her measured, looping script. The letter was short, 3 sentences, precise, legal in tone. It informed Rachel Foster that she was no longer included in Helen Foster's will, and that any prior bequests to her were revoked in full. No explanation, no room for debate. Helen folded it neatly, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with a firm press of her thumb. She addressed it in the same hand she used for holiday cards, because some messages deserved to be delivered with ceremony. The next morning, the letter dropped into the postbox with a satisfying metallic clang. It was already on its way. The call came early, before Helen had even finished buttering her toast. The landline's shrill ring cut through the quiet of her kitchen, startling the mockingbird perched outside her window. She reached for it, already suspecting who would be on the other end. "You've lost your mind." Rachel's voice came through tight and sharp, each word clipped like it had been cut with scissors. "Do you think I wouldn't find out?" Helen spread the butter to the edges of her toast, her voice as even as the knife in her hand. "Find out about what, Rachel? Don't play dumb with me. That letter, what is this supposed to be? A joke?" "No joke," Helen said, setting her knife down. "You are no longer included in my will." The letter made that perfectly clear. There was a stunned pause on the line, then the hiss of an indrawn breath. "After everything," Helen interrupted gently. "After everything, yes." The line went quiet for half a beat, and then David's voice appeared, low but tense. "Mom, this isn't the season for grudges." Helen closed her eyes briefly, taking in the morning smells of toast and fresh coffee, letting them ground her. "This isn't about grudges, David. It's about respect. You were there that morning, or rather you weren't. That was enough." David exhaled hard, as though trying to steady the conversation. "Can we at least talk in person? Maybe undo whatever this is?" "No, David. This is done." Helen's voice was steady, the words landing like smooth stones on water. "You can come by for coffee if you'd like to visit, but the paperwork stands." Rachel's voice surged back in, sharp enough to sting. "You're making a mistake." Helen let the silence answer for her and hung up, the click as final as the letter had been. Not 5 minutes later, the front door opened, and Evelyn stepped inside, a paper bakery box in hand, and the cold December air clinging to her coat. "Well," she said, setting the box on the counter, You look like someone who's just exercised her God-given right to peace of mind. Rachel called. Helen said, lifting the lid to find two perfect apple turnovers dusted in powdered sugar. Of course she did. Evelyn shrugged off her coat. I'd call it predictable if it weren't so satisfying. They ate at the kitchen table, the turnovers still faintly warm, the cinnamon filling spilling onto their plates. The conversation drifted to other things. The new mayor, the church's winter charity drive, but Helen could feel the letter's shadow in the room, as real as the scent of coffee between them. After Evelyn left, Helen climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The space smelled faintly of cedar and dust, and the single bulb cast a warm cone of light over the stacked boxes and covered furniture. She pulled out a quilt her grandmother had stitched, the pattern of stars still bright after decades. Setting it aside for Emily felt right. Next came a jewelry box, rosewood with a delicate inlay Helen had bought from a traveling craftsman in Charleston. She opened it, the faint scent of lavender sachets rising up, and smiled at the thought of Emily discovering the hidden compartment beneath the ring tray. She worked methodically, sorting keepsakes into a large wicker basket, a set of first edition novels, a small oil painting of the marshlands, a silver locket with a photograph of Helen as a young woman. Every piece chosen was something Rachel would neither value nor understand. The phone rang again, its sound echoing faintly through the attic rafters. She considered letting it go to the machine, but curiosity nudged her downstairs. It was Charles's voice this time, calm but edged with something sharper. Helen, I just got a voicemail from Rachel. You'll want to hear this. Helen sat in the quiet of her parlor, the phone warm against her ear as Charles Denton's voice threaded through the line. His tone carried the cool precision of a man who'd spent decades dismantling assumptions. Rachel has no legal standing to contest your trust, he said. She isn't a beneficiary anymore, and the assets in a properly executed trust bypass probate entirely. Even if she wanted to challenge the will, it wouldn't touch what's in the trust. Helen glanced at the stack of paperwork neatly filed on the side table, the manila folder like a sealed vault. So she can't drag this into court. She could try, Charles said, with the faintest humor. But it would be a waste of her time and money. She'd lose before the first hearing. The knot in Helen's chest loosened by a fraction. That's good to hear. I'm done with drama. Finding its way into my home, then enjoy that peace, Charles advised. You've earned it. After hanging up, Helen let the phone rest on the arm of the chair. The afternoon light angled through the tall windows, catching in the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. She allowed herself a deep breath, the kind that felt like it reached all the way down to her ribs. Not 10 minutes later, Evelyn strode in without knocking, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from their favorite cafe. I've been thinking, she said, handing one to Helen and kicking off her boots by the door. We need to celebrate this new chapter of yours. Helen smiled faintly. And how do you propose we do that? A trip. Nothing dramatic, just a weekend. Tybee Island. We'll walk the pier, eat shrimp straight off the boats, let the salt air clear all this out of your head. Helen took a sip of coffee, the caramel sweetness warming her tongue. It's been years since I've been out there in winter. The beach is almost empty. Exactly. Evelyn sat across from her, leaning in. No Rachel, no David, just ocean and gulls and us. The idea rooted itself quickly. By the time Evelyn left, Helen was at her desk, opening her laptop. The hotel she chose had wraparound balconies and white wicker chairs, the kind of place where the sound of the tide could lull her to sleep. She booked a suite for 2 nights, the confirmation email arriving like a small victory. That evening, while Helen was finishing a crossword, her phone chimed. A text from Emily lit the screen. Grandma, I heard about the changes you made. I don't know how to thank you. I promise I'll take care of everything you've worked for. I love you. Helen read it twice, her eyes softening. She tapped out a reply. Simple, heartfelt, and for the first time all week a real smile spread across her face. It wasn't about the money, it was about knowing her legacy was going somewhere it would be valued. She set the phone aside and leaned back in her chair, letting the satisfaction settle in. Outside, The street lamps were just flickering on, casting warm pools of light over the brick sidewalk. Somewhere down the block, the faint sound of someone laughing drifted through the crisp air. Helen was halfway to the kitchen to start a pot of tea when a sharp knock rattled her front door. 3 firm raps, urgent, not neighborly. Through the glass pane, she saw David standing on the porch, his shoulders tense, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. He hadn't called first. Helen opened the door to find David standing on the porch, his coat zipped to the throat, cheeks flushed from the wind. His eyes moved past her into the house, as if checking for someone else before he spoke. "Mom," he began, forcing a smile that didn't settle. "Can we talk?" Helen stepped aside, but didn't widen the door much. "If you're here about the will or the trust, David, you can save your breath. I'm here because this has gotten out of hand," he said, brushing past her into the front hall anyway. His boots left faint wet marks on the wood. "Rachel's hurt. You've always said family matters more than paperwork." Helen closed the door with a soft click, the kind that said she was still the one deciding when it opened again. "Family does matter. Respect matters more." David's jaw flexed. "You can't just cut someone out without talking it through." "That's exactly what I can do," Helen replied, moving toward the parlor. She didn't offer him a seat, but he took one on the edge of the armchair anyway, leaning forward like a man making a pitch. "Be reasonable," he urged. "We all say things we regret. We all have bad days. Rachel is in your car," Helen said evenly. She'd noticed the silver SUV idling at the curb when she opened the door. If she wanted to talk, she could have walked up those steps. David looked toward the window, his mouth opening and closing once before he spoke again. "She's embarrassed. She doesn't know what to say. Yet she knows what to say to Charles Denton's voicemail," Helen said, her tone neither sharp nor forgiving, just true. David shifted, the leather of the chair sighing under him. "So that's it? No chance of fixing this?" Helen folded her hands in her lap. "David, this isn't about grudges. This is about making sure my life's work ends up where it will be appreciated. You and Rachel made your position clear on Christmas morning." His eyes darted away. "I didn't. You didn't come to the door," Helen said. That was enough. The clock on the mantel ticked between them. Outside, the SUV's exhaust curled into the cold air, visible in the gap between curtains. Finally David stood. "I just wish you'd think about it." "I have," Helen said, rising as well. She walked him to the door, opening it to the crisp afternoon. "Drive safe, David." He hesitated on the threshold, searching her face for something in opening, maybe, or a hint of softness. She gave him neither. The SUV pulled away moments later, tires crunching over the gravel at the edge of the street. Helen let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had just reached the kitchen when a familiar voice called from the front hall. "Did I miss the circus?" Evelyn appeared, cheeks pink from the cold, holding a cloth bag that smelled faintly of fresh scones. "You missed the final act," Helen said, taking the bag from her. "Tea? Always." Evelyn hung her coat and followed her into the kitchen. They filled the kettle, the whistle later cutting through the house with a clean, bright note. They drank their tea in the sunlit corner of the parlor, the china warm in their hands, talking about the trip to Tybee Island instead of the conversation that had just ended at the door. It was nearly dusk when the email alert chimed on Helen's phone. She picked it up, sliding her reading glasses into place. From Charles Denton, subject, "Trust documents." Recorded, the message was brief but final. "Attached are the fully executed and recorded trust documents for your files. Everything is officially secured." Helen tapped the attachment. The pages opened on the screen, her own signature crisp at the bottom of each. A vault, sealed. The morning after Charles emailed the scanned trust documents, the county courthouse recorded them in full. Helen imagined the seal pressed onto the official copies, a quiet, permanent stamp that said, "This is no longer yours to take." Outside, Savannah's air was brisk and sharp, carrying the faint scent of the river. Inside her Victorian, Helen poured herself a second cup of coffee and began the next step, making sure every loose thread was tied. She sat at the roll-top desk in her study, the soft rasp of the oak cover sliding upward, like the start of a ritual. One by one, she pulled account folders from the cubbyholes, savings, investments, insurance, and set them in a neat stack. Evelyn arrived 10 minutes later, bundled in a thick scarf, cheeks pink from the walkover, ready to play defense. Evelyn asked, unwinding the scarf and setting down a leather tote full of forms and pens. More like a clean sweep, Helen replied, handing her a mug of coffee. They worked side by side at the desk. Helen signed beneficiary updates, while Evelyn cross-checked lists against the trust's terms. The smell of fresh ink filled the air as each page was completed, the signatures dark and certain. It wasn't just paperwork, it was a tightening of the drawbridge. Around midday, Helen stepped out to the mailbox to post the forms. On her way back in, she paused by the mantel. A photograph of her late husband still stood there, the frame catching the pale light. "It's all going where it should," she murmured to him, though her voice barely rose above the sound of the kettle beginning to boil in the kitchen. By late afternoon, the phone's voicemail light was blinking again. She pressed play. David's voice came through, strained. "Mom, please, I think we've all let this get too far. I know you're angry, but Rachel's trying, she's willing to meet you halfway. Just call me. We can work this out." Helen deleted the message without replaying it. Later, Evelyn scrolled her phone at the kitchen table and raised an eyebrow. "Rachel's been busy on Facebook." Helen didn't ask, but Evelyn read aloud anyway. "Sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest." Followed by a photo of a wilted rose. "She's got 5 likes and a praying for you comment." Helen stirred her tea, the spoon tapping lightly against the porcelain. If that's her version of diplomacy, she'll be waiting a long time for a treaty. The next morning brought a different voice. Helen's phone rang just after breakfast, and Emily's name lit the screen. "Hi, Grandma," Emily said, the warmth in her tone like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I just wanted to check on you. Dad seems stressed." Helen smiled faintly. "I'm fine, darling. I've been organizing the house. You'd be amazed how much there is in the attic alone." "I'd believe it," Emily laughed. "I still remember the first time you showed me that quilt your grandmother made. I thought it belonged in a museum." "It belongs with someone who understands it," Helen said. Emily's voice softened. "Well, if you ever need help sorting through things, I'd love to come over." They talked for another 10 minutes, about Emily's classes, her new photography project, and how the winter light in Savannah made even the simplest streets look like paintings. When they hung up, Helen lingered with the phone still in her hand. The attic, the quilt, the rosewood jewelry box. The thought took root before she could push it away. Why wait for lawyers and paperwork? She could place those treasures into Emily's hands now while she was alive to see her face. She looked toward the staircase leading upward, the dim outline of the attic door at the top. The idea sharpened into something certain. By the time Evelyn returned that afternoon, Helen was already making a list, items to be packed, polished, and passed on. Not someday. Now, Helen stood in the attic with the pull chain light casting a warm circle over dust-dappled boxes. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old linen. In front of her, an oak chest sat against the far wall, its brass hardware dulled by decades. She knelt, opened the lid and peeled back layers of tissue paper until the gleam caught her breath. Her grandmother's silver set 12-place settings, the handles engraved with a curling vine pattern, still shone as if it had been waiting for this exact day. Helen's fingers traced the cool surface of a serving spoon, remembering Sunday dinners when the silver had been polished to perfection, ready to impress guests who no longer walked this earth. "This is going to Emily," she murmured, as if the air needed to hear it. Downstairs, Evelyn was wrapping mugs in newspaper at the dining room table when Helen appeared with the first load. "Well," Evelyn said, eyeing the gleam, "if that girl doesn't cry when she sees this, I'll eat the box it's in." The next treasure was the vintage writing desk Helen had kept in the upstairs study for years, a mahogany beauty with tiny brass pulls and a fold-down front. Inside were pigeonholes lined with faded green felt and a secret compartment she'd discovered only by accident decades ago. She cleaned it carefully, running a soft cloth over the surface until the wood drank in its old luster. By mid-morning, Emily's little hatchback was parked in front of the house. The winter air was crisp enough to sting, and the scent of pine drifted from the wreath on Helen's door. Emily stepped out, scarf trailing in the breeze, eyes bright with anticipation. "What's all this?" she asked, spotting the silver chest on the porch. "Gifts," Helen said simply. "For you. While I'm here to watch you enjoy them." Emily lifted the lid of the chest, her breath catching audibly. "Grandma, this is your grandmother's silver. It's yours now," Helen said, her tone gentle but unwavering. "I can't." Emily's eyes shimmered, and she pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. "I don't deserve you." "You do," Helen interrupted, smiling faintly, "because you understand what it means." They loaded the desk next, Evelyn maneuvering one side while Emily took the other. The wood was heavy, smelling faintly of lemon oil from Helen's polishing that morning. When it was safely in the back of the car, Emily stood still for a moment, hands on the door, as if committing the moment to memory. "I'll take care of them," she promised. "I know," Helen said, and it was the truth. They hugged, Emily holding on longer than usual, her scarf brushing against Helen's cheek. The hatchback pulled away a few minutes later, silver and mahogany tucked safely inside. Helen stood on the porch watching until it turned the corner, the winter sun flashing across the rear window. Inside, the house felt lighter. The silver chest's usual spot in the dining room now held only a faint square of dust. The upstairs study, once anchored by the writing desk, seemed to breathe without it. These were good absences, Helen thought. Spaces filled by the knowledge that her things were already where they belonged. It wasn't until late afternoon that the ripple reached the wrong ears. Evelyn returned from a quick walk to the bakery with a raised eyebrow. "Guess who just passed by me on the sidewalk looking like she'd swallowed a lemon whole?" Helen didn't need to guess. Rachel, apparently Mrs. Duncan, your neighbor with the gingerbread house obsession, told her she saw Emily loading antiques into her car. Rachel's face, Evelyn shook her head with a low chuckle. "I wish I'd had a camera." Helen poured them both tea, letting the steam rise between them like a curtain. She didn't comment further. Rachel's reaction wasn't her concern. The house had just settled into its evening quiet when the phone rang. Helen reached for it, expecting Evelyn's dry humor or Emily's warm gratitude again. Instead, David's voice came through, a careful mix of casual and strained. "So," he said, "is there anything left for us?" David's question still lingered in Helen's ear like a note struck too hard on a piano. She adjusted the phone against her shoulder, her free hand resting on the edge of the kitchen counter. "No," she said plainly. "My estate is spoken for." A pause, then the faint sound of wind on the other end, and Rachel's voice sharper, louder, breaking through. "You can't just erase people like that. It's disgusting." Helen glanced toward the window where the late winter sun slanted across the porch. "Rachel, I didn't erase anyone. I allocated my property to those who value it." David cut in quickly, his voice taut. "Mom, can you just listen for a second? We're not asking for—" Helen kept her tone even. "You are. And the answer is no." In the background, Rachel's voice rose again. "She's punishing us. This is punishment." Helen's patience, like a thread frayed over time, finally snapped. "Rachel, you slammed a door in my face on Christmas morning. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a message. I've heard it loud and clear." There was a beat of silence, broken only by a car engine idling faintly in the background. Then Rachel shouted something unintelligible, and David's voice returned, tighter now. "This isn't how family handles things." Helen straightened. "No, David. This is how I handle things, when family forgets to act like it." She pressed the end call button before he could reply. The kitchen went still, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly the loudest sound in the room. She set the phone down as if it were something fragile she didn't need anymore. The doorbell rang 20 minutes later. Evelyn stood there with a bunch of bright tulips wrapped in brown paper, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "I heard raised voices in your tone when you answered just now," Evelyn said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "So I brought reinforcements." She held out the flowers like a peace treaty. Helen accepted them with a small smile. Tulips in January. I didn't think anyone sold them yet. Only the good florist does, Evelyn replied. Now let's find you a vase and a distraction. They filled a crystal vase in the kitchen, the stems releasing a faint green scent as Helen trimmed them. Evelyn settled onto the couch in the parlor, while Helen queued up a stack of old films on the TV. The light in the room softened as the first black and white picture flickered to life, casting shadows across the bookshelves and polished wood. For hours they let the dialogue of Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn fill the spaces where conversation might have drifted back to the morning's phone call. Helen laughed at all the same spots she had when she was 25, though now the laughter came from a different place, lighter, freer. By the time the credits rolled on the third film, the night had wrapped itself around the house. The only light came from the sconces and the muted glow of the TV. Evelyn stretched, gathering her coat. See, you can have a good evening without letting other people's bad manners in the door. Helen walked her to the porch, the tulips now brightening the center of the dining table. The air outside was cool and smelled faintly of the marsh. When she came back inside, her phone buzzed on the counter. It wasn't David this time. The caller ID read Charles Denton. She answered. Helen, Charles said, his voice warm with a trace of amusement. I have 2 tickets to the Historical Society's charity gala next weekend. Black tie, good wine, better gossip. I think you should come. Helen looked over at the tulips, their petals just starting to open. Charles, she said slowly, I think I just might. The ballroom glowed like a jewelry box under the chandeliers, each crystal drop catching the light from the sconces and tossing it across the high plaster ceiling. Helen stood just inside the grand double doors, her emerald dress skimming the polished floor, Evelyn beside her in deep navy silk. The scent of roses and white lilies floated in the air, mingling with the warm aroma of champagne. Charles wasn't kidding, Evelyn murmured, taking in the sea of sequined gowns and tailored tuxedos. I'd forgotten how nice it feels to be somewhere people are actually civil. Helen smiled faintly. It's refreshing, isn't it? A uniformed attendant led them to the mayor's table at the front of the room, the linen so white it almost glowed under the lights. The mayor himself rose to greet Helen, shaking her hand warmly. Mrs. Foster, it's an honor. Your work preserving Savannah's Victorian history is nothing short of remarkable. Helen inclined her head graciously, slipping into the seat at his right. Evelyn sat to her left, already eyeing the dessert cart rolling toward the far end of the room. The evening moved like a well-rehearsed play. Wine glasses chimed, forks slid across china, and the low hum of polite conversation filled the air. Helen spoke with the mayor about the restoration of her own home, the importance of keeping original details intact, and the future of preservation efforts in the historic district. The applause from the table after her remarks was warm and genuine. Midway through the main course, Charles appeared, his bow tie slightly askew but his expression pleased. Helen, if you don't mind, he said, offering her his arm. There's someone I'd like you to meet before dessert. She rose, curious, and let him lead her to the stage where a podium stood under the bright lights. The room quieted as the MC's voice carried over the microphone. Tonight we are pleased to recognize Mrs. Helen Foster for her decades of dedication to preserving Savannah's architectural history and cultural heritage. A wave of applause swept the room, and Helen felt her cheeks warm, though her spine stayed straight. Charles handed her a plaque, polished wood with a brass plate engraved with her name, and the weight of it in her hands felt different from any award she'd ever received. This wasn't just for effort, it was for endurance. When she returned to the table, Evelyn was grinning like she'd known this was coming all along. Seat of honor, public recognition, and we're only halfway through the evening. Not bad. Dessert was in full swing when Helen spotted Emily weaving through the tables, a smile lighting her face. She wore a simple black dress, and carried a clutch that looked far too small for the phone she inevitably had tucked inside. Grandma, Emily leaned down to kiss her cheek. I didn't want to miss this. I'm so proud of you. Helen's hand rested briefly over Emily's. Thank you, darling. Sit, there's cake. Emily stayed for coffee and dessert, telling stories about her classes and showing Helen a few of her photographs on her phone. The images of the marsh at dusk and the old iron gates downtown reminded Helen why she'd chosen Emily to inherit, not just the tangible pieces, but the intangible appreciation of beauty. Somewhere across town, Helen knew David and Rachel would be hearing about this from someone, perhaps a mutual acquaintance, or more likely a social media post tagged with the mayor's name. The thought neither stung nor thrilled her. It simply underscored the distance she'd chosen. By the time the orchestra struck its final note, and the guests began drifting toward the coat check, Helen felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The evening had been hers, her company, her recognition, her place at the table. Outside, under the soft glow of the street lamps, Evelyn tucked her hand through Helen's arm. "You know," she said, "we ought to mark this properly. A real trip. Somewhere that's just ours." Helen looked over at her friend, the idea already blooming in her mind. "I think I know exactly where." The Monday after the gala, Helen sat in Charles Denton's office for what she knew would be the final time regarding her estate. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, throwing long bars of gold across the polished conference table. A stack of manila folders sat neatly in front of her, each labeled in Charles' precise handwriting. "This," Charles said, tapping the top folder, "is the comprehensive package. Your will, your trust, updated beneficiary forms, and letters of instruction, every asset, every account, every heirloom, accounted for and routed exactly as you've directed." Helen rested her hands lightly on the cover. "And there's no scenario where Rachel can challenge this." "None that would hold in court," Charles said. "Between the trust and the will, the structure is airtight. She's out. Permanently." The word permanently felt like a door clicking shut in her chest, in the best possible way. She flipped through the pages slowly, absorbing the finality in black ink. Her home, her antiques, her savings, even the little rental property she'd almost forgotten she owned, every one of them bypassed Rachel entirely. When the last page was signed, Charles slid the documents into a locked briefcase. "I'll file the originals with the secure archive and send copies to you. You're officially done, Helen." For a moment she simply sat there, letting the quiet in the room settle around her like a blanket. Then she smiled, not the small, guarded smiles she'd been wearing lately, but one that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Charles. I feel lighter." Back at her house, the front door swung open to reveal Emily standing there, a paper bag from the bakery in her hands. The smell of fresh blueberry muffins filled the hall. "I heard you were meeting with Mr. Denton," Emily said, stepping inside. "I just wanted to say thank you again, for trusting me. For all of it." Helen set the muffins on the counter and turned to face her granddaughter. "It's not about trust, Emily. It's about knowing you'll value what I've worked for. I'd rather give my life's work to someone who will keep it alive, than to someone who would see it as a number in a bank account." Emily's eyes glistened, but she nodded with quiet understanding. "I won't let you down." Later that afternoon, Evelyn arrived, two champagne flutes in hand, and a small bottle tucked under her arm. "Today's the day, isn't it?" she asked, setting them on the coffee table without waiting for an answer. "It's all final," Helen said, pouring the champagne. The bubbles hissed gently, releasing a faint scent of citrus. Evelyn lifted her glass, to decisiveness, and to keeping the wrong hands off the good silver. Helen laughed, the sound filling the parlor in a way it hadn't in months. They drank, the late winter sun filtering through the lace curtains, and for the first time in years, Helen felt her shoulders relax completely. There were no more loose ends, no more papers waiting to be signed, no more conversations to avoid. When Evelyn left, Helen stood in the quiet of her living room, her eyes moving over the space, the polished wood floors, the mantel with its mix of old photographs and fresh tulips, the antique sideboard that had been in her family for 3 generations. Every piece, every wall, every memory in this house was safe now. She walked upstairs to her study, sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began typing into the search bar. Holiday Cruises, December 2025. The thought had been simmering since Evelyn's suggestion outside the gala. Christmas next year would not be spent under the shadow of slammed doors or tense dinners. It would be warm salt air, a deck chair angled toward a turquoise horizon, and the sound of waves instead of voices raised in anger. She scrolled through itineraries, Caribbean, Mediterranean, even South America, but her eyes kept returning to one particular listing, a 3-week holiday voyage through the Caribbean, ending just after New Year's. Ports in St. Lucia, Barbados, and Antigua. Formal dinners on deck. Midnight champagne under the stars. Helen clicked book now before she could second-guess herself. As the confirmation page loaded, she felt a rush of something that was equal parts relief and anticipation. This wasn't just a trip, it was a declaration. Next holiday season, she wouldn't just avoid Rachel and David's drama. She would be far beyond its reach, watching the coastline recede from the rail of a ship that belonged entirely to her own plans. She closed the laptop, the faint metallic click sounding like the final lock on a door she would never open again. The gangway rose ahead of her like a bridge to another life. Helen stepped onto the cruise ship's deck, the boards warm underfoot even in December, and felt Savannah's winter fade from her shoulders. Beside her, Evelyn tilted her wide-brimmed hat to catch the sea breeze, the brim rippling like a slow wave. "Smell that," Evelyn said, inhaling deeply. "Salt and freedom." Helen smiled. And not a single slammed door in sight. The ship's horn gave a low, resonant call that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Crew members in crisp white uniforms guided them toward their stateroom, the corridor lined with polished brass rails and carpet patterned in deep blues. From their balcony, the port shrank as the ship eased away from the dock, the shoreline slipping past until it became nothing but a thin line against the afternoon sky. 2 days later, Savannah was wrapped in a cold rainstorm, but Helen stood barefoot on the deck under a sun that poured gold across the Caribbean. The air was heavy with the scent of coconut oil and grilled fish from the buffet. Somewhere nearby, a steel drum played a lazy calypso rhythm that seemed to slow the pace of her thoughts. She reclined beside Evelyn on cushioned deck chairs, both of them in linen cover-ups and wide sunglasses, the sea stretching unbroken to the horizon. "I could get used to this," Evelyn murmured, raising her glass of champagne. "You already have," Helen said, clinking her own glass against it. The bubbles rose and snapped softly on her tongue, the faint citrus note cutting through the warm air. Her phone sat on the table between them, screen dark. It had buzzed twice that morning, but she hadn't looked. Whoever it was, David, Rachel, or some well-meaning neighbor, it could wait until the ship docked in Antigua. Maybe longer. Instead, she reached for the envelope Emily had tucked into her carry-on before they'd left. Inside was a Christmas card with a photograph of Emily standing beside the silver chest, the green scarf from last year looped around her neck. The caption read, "Merry Christmas, Grandma. Everything is exactly where it belongs." Helen's chest warmed more than the sun could manage. She set the card carefully back in its envelope and slipped it into her beach bag. That afternoon they wandered the open-air market at St. Kitts, the stalls filled with hand-woven baskets, bright sarongs, and bottles of local rum. The air was thick with the scent of spices, nutmeg, cinnamon, clove, and the calls of vendors eager to share their goods. Helen bought a small carved wooden box for Emily, imagining the look on her face when she discovered the hidden drawer inside. By Christmas Eve, the ship was anchored off Barbados. Dinner was served under strings of white lights strung across the top deck, the ocean a black silk backdrop flecked with the reflection of the stars. A trio played soft jazz near the railing, and waiters moved silently between tables with silver trays of lobster and champagne flutes. Evelyn leaned across the table. "Tell me, Helen, do you miss it? The tree, the wrapping paper, the awkward small talk." Helen sipped her champagne, the stem of the glass cool between her fingers. "Not in the slightest." When midnight came, they joined a group of fellow travelers near the bow, where the captain himself poured a final round of champagne. The laughter around her was unforced, buoyed by the soft slap of waves against the hull. Helen tilted her face toward the wind, letting it carry away every trace of the Christmas she'd left behind in Savannah. The next morning, Christmas Day, Emily's message arrived, a photo of her in front of her tiny apartment tree, wearing the locket Helen had given her from the attic. "Dinner with friends tonight." The caption read, "It's perfect here." Helen smiled but didn't reply right away. She slipped the phone back into her bag and turned her attention to the endless horizon. Somewhere behind her, in a cold house, with curtains drawn too tight, David and Rachel were likely dissecting her absence. But their opinions couldn't follow her here. Not over this much water. By the final night of the voyage, as the ship cut a slow, steady path toward its next port, Helen stood at the railing with Evelyn beside her. The air was warm, the stars so sharp they looked like they could pierce the darkness. Laughter floated across the deck, mingling with the low hum of the engines. Helen set her glass down, resting her hands on the rail. "I'll never do it again," she said. Evelyn glanced over. "Do what?" "Spend another holiday at their mercy." The key turned in Helen's front door with the familiar weight of home. She stepped inside, the hush of the house wrapping around her like a soft coat, after weeks of salt air and island music. The faint scent of lemon polish lingered, exactly how she'd left it, proof that her absence had changed nothing here except her. The suitcases waited just inside the threshold, their wheels still carrying the grit of Caribbean docks. She toed off her shoes, enjoying the cool give of the worn runner under her feet, and began unpacking in the quiet rhythm of someone who had no need to rush. From the top of her bag, she lifted the small carved wooden box she'd bought in St. Kitts, the one with the hidden drawer. She set it on the hall table, running her fingers over its smooth lid. Next came a tin of island tea leaves, the faint perfume of hibiscus and citrus escaping as she set it by the kettle. Folded linen napkins from a market in Barbados, cream with hand-stitched blue edges, went into the dining room hutch, where they seemed to brighten the whole shelf. But the most important item she unpacked was the photograph. It had been taken on their last night at sea, Helen and Evelyn, in deck chairs, champagne flutes in hand, the black water stretching endlessly behind them. Someone had caught them mid-laugh, heads tipped toward each other, eyes crinkled in the kind of joy that doesn't require explanation. Helen crossed to the mag. She moved a vast 2 inches to the left, gave the frame a final polish with her sleeve, and set the photograph where the morning sun would touch it first. The kettle began to hum, and she poured the hibiscus tea into a porcelain pot, the deep red liquid swirling like the sunset over Antigua. She had just set out 2 cups when she heard the creak of the front gate and the sound of light footsteps on the porch. Emily appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the walk, a camera bag slung over one shoulder. "I was hoping you'd be back," she said, unwinding her scarf. "I wanted to hear everything." Helen smiled and gestured toward the table. "Sit, you'll hear it all, at least the parts fit for a grandmother to tell." They talked over steaming tea and slices of ginger cake Helen had saved from the freezer. Emily listened with wide eyes as Helen described the open-air markets, the turquoise coves, the midnight toast under the stars. In turn, Emily told her about Christmas dinner with friends, how the silver set had looked on her table, and the compliments it had drawn. "That's exactly why it's yours," Helen said, lifting her cup, "because you made it part of something warm." A slant of sunlight cut across the front hall, pooling at the base of the door. Dust motes danced in the beam, rising and falling like they were caught in an invisible tide. Helen noticed how the warmth reached almost to the mantel, brushing the corner of the new photograph. For a moment she just sat back and breathed in the scene. Emily's quiet happiness, the faint floral note of the tea, the steady tick of the clock in the parlor. No tension, no waiting for a call that might sour the day. Just peace, earned and settled. When Emily left an hour later, hugging her tightly at the door, Helen stayed in the hall a long while after it closed. She looked again at the photograph on the mantel, the curve of Evelyn's smile, the certainty in her own expression that this was the life she wanted now. Her eyes flicked to the brass lock on the front door. How many times had she opened it to people who brought nothing but noise? How many times had she hoped for civility and received coldness instead? Not anymore. She turned the lock with a decisive click. The sound was small, but it carried through the stillness like a seal being set. Some doors stay closed for good reason.